Hey everybody, here we are in week 10. I hope you enjoyed your break. This week we will be talking about how Americans are going to try to cope with the Depression, how the American government, including FDR and his New Deal plans, attempt to cope with the devastation as well. And we're going to have a lot of acronyms, alphabet organizations this week. Just remember to consult your book and the lecture notes if you can't quite remember the abbreviation for something, because there are going to be quite a few of these. So according to testimony in a 1934 congressional hearing, 2019 cities and other governmental entities had already defaulted on their debt. The first 100 days, so Roosevelt had a 100 days policy. During the first 100 days of his administration, Roosevelt showed his determination to act forcefully by calling Congress into emergency session the day after his inauguration and passing more than a dozen major legislative initiatives over the next 100 days. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. As you can tell from all the many organizations on this slide here, there are way too many for me to talk about all of them. So I'm going to talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. The CCC employed 500,000 out-of-work young men in conservation at the rate of $35 per month plus room and board. Now remember, they're working in conservation, so there's some of that progressive legacy too. By the time the CCC expired in 1942, it had put more than 3 million Americans to work. It involved, okay, this is very important. I'm like ready to read it. I'm like, wait, this is important. This is important. The CCC involved the federal government for the first time in direct unemployment relief. The government had never been directly involved in unemployment relief before. The CCC is the very first time that the federal government becomes involved in direct unemployment relief. My second example is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA built a series of hydroelectric dams that supplied cheap power, recreation, and much-needed jobs to the poorest states in the nation. The TVA won the support of both conservative Democrats in the South and progressives in the North, and it transformed the Cotton Belt into the Sun Belt. A couple other things I'll just mention. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, paid farmers to take acreage out of production. Remember, we talked about the Dust Bowl and the crisis and how there were many acres of land not being used. So farmers instead began to plow under cotton and corn, and they slaughtered 6 million piglets. The AAA raised farm income by 50% between 1933 and 1937, nearly recovering the losses of Hoover's years. New Deal programs proved overwhelmingly popular with the voters in the midterm elections. Democrats won an additional 10 seats in the Senate, controlling 3/4 of the seats there, and won another 14 seats in the House, controlling over 3/4 of the seats there. New Deal Administrator Harry Hopkins gushed, quote, "Boys, this is our hour. We've got to get everything we want, a works program, Social Security, wages and hours, everything, now or never. Get your minds to work on developing a complete ticket to provide security for all the folks of this country, up and down and across the board." In the midst of all this, the Depression persisted. In 1935, the unemployment rate was 20%. So the administration responds with the Second New Deal, and the Second New Deal moved further to the left to avoid more radical change being advocated by various radicals. It redefined the place of government in American life. The legitimate object of government became to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all or cannot do so well for themselves in their individual capacities. So we had more organizations come out of this. The REA, the Rural Electrification Administration. See, I can't even say them. When it began in 1935, when the REA began, only 2 in 10 farms had electricity. When the REA finished, 9 in 10 did. The work of the REA replaced grim drudgery and grind, which had been the common lot of 8 generations of American farm women. Light means washing machines. It means radios. It means rural America is becoming to get more into the fold of the rest of America. So rural America becomes incorporated into mass culture for the first time because of the REA. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, put 8.5 million Americans to work, injecting $11 billion into the economy, building some 650,000 miles of roads, 124,000 bridges, and 125,000 public buildings. LaGuardia Airport in New York City and the Bay Bridge in San Francisco were built under this project. The WPA was more aggressive than the PWA, but by 1936 it employed 7% of the workforce. It put unemployed Americans to work for the government as a means of increasing purchasing power. The most lasting and consequential New Deal measure that was the cornerstone of the welfare state was Social Security. Social Security was meant to take the elderly out of the workforce. It provided 26 million Americans with pensions of $10 to $80 per month that were paid for by payroll taxes and employer contributions, not from the federal budget. FDR realized that the payroll tax took money out of the economy, but insisted, quote, with those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. The payroll tax and the inclusion of the middle class in the program made Social Security an entitlement rather than the beggar's allowance as some dismissed it as, because you paid into it. It was money that you put in there. So it is money that is owed to you. You are getting your own money. So you are entitled to that money. So it's not charity, it's something you're entitled to. That's what I mean when I say entitlement. So how did Congress pay for the New Deal? Congress imposed a 79% tax on incomes above $5 million it was imposed on only one person, John Rockefeller. The basic rate for tax remained at 4% for most taxpayers. Fewer than 1 in 20 Americans paid any income tax at all. The popularity of these programs was proven at the polls in the 1936 elections, which Roosevelt won by 28 million votes, nearly double the number of his opponent. So, did the New Deal end the Depression? No, it didn't. The New Deal didn't end the Depression. World War II did. But by advocating reform, Roosevelt avoided the kind of political and social revolutions that occurred in Italy, Germany, and Japan. And the New Deal reduced an immense amount of human suffering. It showed that faced with the worldwide collapse of capitalism and of all kinds of traditional authority, the federal government could keep people alive and give them hope. It stabilized capitalism by distributing its benefits more equitably. The New Deal produced lasting and substantial social change. And it also produced a dramatic shift in American politics, including a fundamental realignment of the two main political parties. This was due to the remarkable political alliance that backed the New Deal, the New Deal Coalition. FDR constructed a new Democratic coalition from the New Deal that dominated American politics for decades to come. At the core of the New Deal coalition were working-class workers. A 1937 survey of several thousand Chicago residents by a University of Chicago sociologist found that 90%, that's 90% of unskilled workers and 81% of semi-skilled workers supported the New Deal. As one North Carolina mill worker put it, quote, "Mr. Roosevelt is the only man we ever had in the White House who would understand my boss as a son of a bitch." Black workers in particular shifted their allegiance, increasing their support for the Democratic Party by 132% between 1932 and 1936. African Americans made a remarkable change. They went from being the most loyal Republican voters in the U.S. to some of the most loyal Democrats. 76% of black voters voted for FDR in 1936. Alongside the urban working class, the other major element of the New Deal coalition was the Democratic South. Southerners dominated congressional committees. Senators and congressmen from the one-party South kept their jobs for decades. White supremacist Southern Democrats were the gatekeepers of any congressional bill. As the Democratic Party became more liberal, more willing to use state power to reform economic and social relations. It increasingly threatened Southern Democratic leaders invested in the status quo and suspicious of its urban ethnic base. Southern Democrats feared the New Deal's impact on rural power and its liberal attitudes toward racial equality. Georgia Governor Eugene Talmadge sent FDR a letter asking why would anyone work on a farm for 50 cents per day when they could get a $1.30, quote, for pretending to work on a ditch. This argument offered no solution to underconsumption, and FDR replied, quote, I take it you approve of paying farm labor 40 to 50 cents per day. Somehow I cannot get it into my head that wages on such a scale make possible a reasonable American standard of living. When a black clergyman was invited to lead a prayer at the 1936 Democratic Convention, Senator Cotton Ed Smith of South Carolina stormed out of the hall exclaiming, quote, by God, he's as black as melted midnight. Get out of my way. This mongrel meeting ain't no place for a white man, end quote. Though Southern Democrats remained in the party for 30 years, their opposition to racial or economic reform led to the end of New Deal activism after 1937, and they repeatedly backed Dixiecrat presidential candidacies, beginning with Strom Thurmond's candidacy in 1948. Eventually, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, white Southerners left the political party in droves, creating a new Republican coalition. So you may have heard that the political parties swapped. They did. This started with the New Deal coalition, and it was basically finalized with the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the New Deal coalition and its Republican opposition show a shift in the role of political parties in the United States. In the 20th century, the parties were increasingly defined by ideology. Liberalism was coming to mean belief in state power to effect positive change in people's lives. Conservatism was coming to mean opposition to state power in favor of a pre-New Deal status quo. These positions solidified in the decades after the Depression, but they were more a pendulum than fixed positions. Americans vacillated, so they went back and forth. And I'll explain how that worked. During economic downtimes, most Americans wanted state assistance and embraced the party that gave it to them. However, with greater prosperity in the post-war era, frustrations grew as the government was seen as a defender of minority interests. Then, majorities called for cutting back government, even attacking government itself. But every time the economy collapsed and private industry showed itself unable to rescue the economy, great majorities of Americans demanded government intervene. This was true in 1948, in 1973, in 1980, in 2008. New Dealers were elected to end the Depression. The New Deal didn't end the Depression. But again, by advocating for reform, Roosevelt was able to avoid the kind of political and social revolutions that occurred in Italy, Germany, and Japan. So let's put the New Deal into a global context. We can evaluate the New Deal in historical perspective against the sweep of American history. It was totally new in its efforts to aid a people in misery. The New Deal was supposed to end the Depression. It did not. The government didn't spend nearly enough money. World War II provided the massive spending that would lift the U.S. out of depression. But we should also see the New Deal in its world's context. The U.S. was the only one among many nations dealing with depression. Across Europe, through Asia, everywhere, nations suffered. The New Deal, the U.S. reaction to world depression, was less radical, more moderate than Europe. Values bent but did not break. Radical and reactionary challenges were dealt with democratically. FDR saved capitalism by extending its benefits to those who had been left out. This would be a central element of the success of the U.S. after World War II. Americans and their leaders spent the 1930s dealing with domestic problems while the world deteriorated around them. The Depression in Europe led to radical political changes from totalitarian communism to fascist dictatorships. Americans responded by turning away from Europe. Both their isolationism and the global instability surrounding them could be traced back to the Great War. So, in terms of their isolationism, Americans regarded their involvement in the Great War as a mistake. A 1937 poll showed that 70%, that's 70% of Americans believed the United States should have stayed out of that conflict. Isolationist sentiment was already apparent when Congress rejected the U.S. involvement in the League of Nations. American contempt for European affairs became more extreme after European nations defaulted on their enormous debts to the United States from the Great War in the early 1930s, which caused thousands of U.S. banks to fail and reduced the world trade by thirds. So, next time, we will see the consequences of the depression in some of these European places in terms of the governments that spring up out of those depressions. We will also see the beginnings of the Second World War, how the U.S. becomes involved in the war, and yeah, we're going to basically gear up for war in the next one. And then we will, the following week, week 12, we will get to the war, World War II. So in the meantime, make sure that you have completed everything, readings and all that good stuff before we see each other on Wednesday. Remember that your second exam is going to be due this Friday by 11:59 p.m. on Blackboard. And I hope that you all enjoyed this little brief foray into the New Deal, and that you read your book, because Give Me Liberty gives a lot more details on several of these aspects. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions or concerns between now and when we see each other this week.